Good morning. Today is Thursday, May 29th, and we are continuing our study of the Jewish life cycle. And we specifically this spring have been in a long form discussion of the Talmudic and related texts around Jewish marriage and divorce. So let's begin with a bracha, a blessing for study, and then we'll proceed. Baruch atah Adonai. Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. So the settings for our class, as usual, if you have a question, you can use the digital features of Zoom to raise a hand, and then always remember to unmute yourself, and then I'll invite you to speak, or use the chat box to share your reflections or questions, either with the group or with me. So we are now at the very tail end of the Omer. Usually I like to format our spring study to fit between Pesach and Shavuot. Shavuot will be observed this coming Sunday, but we have a bonus section session next week as well. So last class of the season is June 5th. Then we're on a hiatus for summer, and then I'll advise a little bit later what we will do leading up to the high holidays, probably this coming year, because the high holidays they are neither early nor late. They're kind of right in the middle. Rosh Hashanah starts on September 22nd at night. We'll probably do 3 sessions between Labor Day, like after Labor Day, before the high holidays, returning to Maimonides' Mishnah Torah on Hilchot Tshuva, on the laws of repentance. We covered 1 or 2 chapters of that, and there are many more to go. And I think that that's a really nice text to return to in the weeks leading up to the high holidays. So get a long summer break, come back, much more to study in the fall. So I'd like to take up today the subject of interfaith marriage. So our last 2 sessions, having covered marriage and last week divorce in quite some detail, I'd like to return to the subject of unusual marriages that do not fit comfortably within the Jewish tradition. Interfaith marriage being today's subject, and assuming we cover the material I hope to today, then next week we can proceed to same-sex marriage. Both of these are commonplace in today's non-Orthodox, or specifically Reform and Reconstructionist expressions of Judaism, much less common in conservative and Orthodoxy, though if we have time and interest, there might be some interesting material to read from conservative and Orthodox rabbis on how they manage the challenges of people who identify as conservative or Orthodox, but who seek the blessing or the officiation of conservative or Orthodox Jewish clergy at a marriage that, again, I'm going to use the language of resides uncomfortably within the Jewish tradition, or probably less idiomatic, less euphemistically, are outside the Jewish tradition entirely. So today, interfaith marriage, meaning what happens when a Jew marries a Gentile? So the first word on the subject, which of course in Judaism is never the last word, but is often the most powerful word, comes from Torah itself. It's actually, I think, the shortest chapter in all of Torah, Deuteronomy Chapter 7. We're going to look at that text together. So just bear with me as I bring it up on screen. Okay, so Deuteronomy 7 goes like this. I'll start in the Hebrew because any translation erases some of the nuance of the text and is in fact an interpretation by the translator. Ki yaviacha Adonai Elohecha. So literally, when Adonai your God brings you, yaviacha means to bring you. When Adonai your God brings you el haaretz asher ata vashama l'rishta, into the land, el haaretz asher ata vashama, to which you have come, l'rishta, to inherit it. Vin nashal goyim rabim. If you thought you heard an echo of the word goyim, you did. Goyim is the biblical Hebrew word for nations, any nations, but usually it connotes Gentile nations, non-Israelitish nations. So God displaces many foreign nations, mipanecha, from you, so away from you. And then these nations are named here, starting with this word, Hachiti, the Hittites, the Ha-Girgashi, the Girgashites, the Ha-Emori, the Amorites, the Ha-Kenaani, the Canaanites, the Ha-Prizi, the Perizzites, the Ha-Chivi, the Hivites, the Ha-Yivusi, the Jebusites. Now, by my count, that is seven nations, which are considered to be the biblical enemy Gentile nations of the Israelite people. The confusion comes in that there are many texts, many references in the Torah to the enemy nations of the Israelites, often seven, however, not always the same seven. There's usually some overlap, but you will find various lists of the seven Gentile enemy nations of the Israelites that are going to be dispossessed upon the Israelite conquest of the promised land. Because remember, the land is not devoid of inhabitants when the people arrive there after their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. It is populated, and it is populated specifically by people who, if you take the Torah at his word, uh, God doesn't want there. God wants the Israelites to possess the land, but they have to forcefully dispossess the other people through military conquest under the direction of Joshua, Moses' successor. In any case, seven Gentile nations have been living in this land, and the opening frame of Deuteronomy 7 is when God brings you to the land and dislodges, I think is the word they use here, which is great. Great word, dislodge, literally, that they can't live there anymore. Shiva goyim rabim va'atzuvim. So literally seven nations that are numerous and mighty, or numerous and populous, mimecha, more so than you. Okay, so this is all an if-then clause. So when this happens, Unitanam Adonai Elohecha lefanecha, and God delivers them to you. God literally gives over the enemy to you. Vihikitam, and you slay them. You defeat them or destroy them. Hacharem tacharimotam. My translation would be, you must in fact annihilate them. The root of this verb here, cherem, is usually translated as a ban, B-A-N, which is a religious category, not just of defeat of the enemy in a military context, but of utter annihilation or dooming. They say doom them to destruction. The important point about what it means to doom a nation in the biblical context is what is explained in the subsequent clause. So you must in fact doom them to destruction, or I said you must in fact utterly annihilate them. Lo tichrot lahem brit. Don't make any treaties with them. And where the word for treaty is actually a word that all of us know, it's a brit, which means a covenant. Don't make a covenant with them. Don't enter into peaceful relations with these nations. Velo tichonem. And literally give them no quarter, or I would say, don't allow them to reside among you, is the force of that particular verb. So this is a zero-sum game. You are not defeating the enemy for the purpose of living harmoniously together after the war. You are dooming the enemy entirely to destruction. And generally, when there is a cherem, or a ban, on an enemy nation, it also means that you cannot take any spoils of war, because any such spoil would be consecrated to God and therefore illicit for the people to derive benefit from it. So all of this gets into biblical laws of warfare, Torah laws of warfare. And just completing the thought here, because it's all related. Velo titchaten bam bitecha, and do not intermarry with them. Velo, sorry, that I phrased that improperly. Velo titchaten bam. Do not intermarry with them, or do not marry with them. From, by the way, the root of titchaten, which is the verb, is chatan, which means a groom, right? So don't begroom yourself to them, or don't wed them. Bitcha lo titen livno, your daughter, from bat, right? Bitcha, this word here. Bitcha lo titen livno, don't give your daughter to the enemy's son. Uvito lo tikach livnecha, and from their daughters do not take for your sons. In other words, you're not allowed to arrange any marriages for your children between your nation and the enemy nation, between the Israelite nation and the enemy nation. Why? Now the rationale for all of this. So all of that was a long form if-then clause, or a when-then clause. When this happens, when God dispossesses the enemy, you must doom them entirely. You may not make a treaty with them, give them no quarter, do not intermarry with them, do not arrange marriages for your sons or daughters with theirs. Why? Ki is always a word that means because or thence. So when this happens, here's the cause and effect. This is the effect part of the clause. Ki yasir et bincha me'acharai ve'avedu Elohim acherim, because your children will be turned away from me, me'acharai, from me, meaning God, ve'avdu Elohim acherim, and as a result of these intermarriages, they will worship other gods. V'chara af Adonai bachem. Idiomatically, the wrath of God will be kindled against them. Or here they say, Adonai's anger will blaze forth against you. Sorry, it's against you. Though literally, this is one of my favorite biblical idioms. Af Adonai, v'chara af Adonai bachem, literally means God's nose will glow. Like Rudolph, but in anger. So af Adonai v'chara af Adonai bachem. God's nose will glow against them. It's a really colorful image that probably is best left idiomatically translated and not literally translated, because kids would not know what to do with that. V'hishmidecha maher, and it will wipe you out. Meaning God will be really, really angry at you, Israelite people, for violating God's wish by intermarrying with these enemy nations. And as if that weren't enough, as if it weren't enough to destroy the enemy utterly and refuse to make treaties, quarter them, or intermarry with them, instead, ki im ko ta'aseh lahem, instead, this is what you should do to them. Mizivchotehem titotzu, destroy or tear down their altars, their shrines. Umatzevotam tishaberu, shatter their sacred pillars. Va'asherehem tigadeun, cut down their asherot. Asherot were like sacred wooden poles that Canaanites were known to have worshipped, probably fertility imagery. Ufesilehem tisrifun, and burn their idols, ba'esh, in fire. All of this because ki am kadosh ata l'Adonai, for you are a people holy unto Adonai Elohecha, your God. Becha bachar Adonai Elohecha, Adonai your God has chosen you, lihiot lo le'am segula, to be a treasured nation, mikol ha'amim, from among all peoples, asher al pnei ha'adama, upon the face of the earth. And elaborating this theme, lo merubechem mikol ha'amim chashak Adonai bachem, it is not because you are the most numerous of peoples that God desires you, or that God has shown favor to you. Vayivchar bachem, and that God chose you. No, no, not because you are great and mighty in numbers. Ki atem hama'at mikol ha'amim. In fact, you are the smallest of peoples, you Israelites. Not in terms of height. Okay, that too. No, you are the smallest in number. Ki me'ahavat Adonai etchem. It is rather out of God's love for you. Umishomro et hashvua asher nishba la'avotechem, and out of keeping, and in keeping the oath that was sworn to your ancestors, la'avotechem, hotzi Adonai etchem biyad chazakah, did God draw you out, cause you to exit, meaning Egypt, with an outstretched or with a strong hand. Vayiftecha mi beit avadim. Thus did God redeem you from the house of bondage, miyad paro melech Mitzrayim, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We're going to read this whole chapter. V'yadata ki Adonai Elohecha hu ha'Elohim. Thus do you know, or did you learn, that Adonai, your God, is God? Ha'el ha'ne'eman, the faithful deity. Shomer habrit, the one who keeps the covenant. The hachesed, and who also shows loving kindness, le'ohavav, to the one whom God loves, u'leshomere mitzvotav, and to those who keep God's mitzvot, or commandments, le'elef dor, for 1,000 generations. For 1,000 generations, in English, I translated that as a kind of a dangling, is that a misplaced modifier or a dangling participle? It's hanging there at the end of the sentence, and it refers to how much God loves the people. God will love you for 1,000 generations, but u'mishalem lesonav, but who will requite those who hate him or who despise God, el panav, from away from God's presence, lahavido, in order to cause them to perish. Lo ye'acher lesono el panav yeshalem lo. Never delaying those who reject God from God's presence, but rather requiting them. Okay, and then the final line of chapter 7, like I said, very short chapter, only 11 verses. V'shamarta et hamitzvah, thus you should keep the commandments, ve'et hachukim, and the statutes, ve'et hamishpatim, and the case laws, asher anochi metzavacha hayom, which I command you this day, la'asotam, in order to do them. Okay, so and I hope that you were able to either follow my translation, understand the Hebrew, or just read the English as I was scrolling. So that's Deuteronomy chapter 7, a very, very stern admonition against marrying any of these enemy Gentile nations. Judy, you've had your hand up for a long time, and now I'd like to acknowledge it.
My heart is racing, because if this were copied and flyers sent out throughout Palestine, and not only throughout Palestine, throughout the world who is now against us, this is awful.
Yeah.
This is genocide. In the Bible, this is what we were instructed to do.
Yeah.
It is scary. So let's put a curtain on that, and let's see how we have changed as a people, or it's just
either that, or let's lift the curtain from it and examine it and name it exactly for what it is, which you're absolutely right, Judy. Like, for us to say that our scripture is clean and pure and virtuous in the context of 21st century Western morality is absolutely false. Like, that's just a bonkers claim that cannot be made of the Torah. I, as a pedagogue, would much rather that we lift the curtain from these texts without fear or shame and acknowledge that arising from the context of biblical history 3,000 years or so ago, this was the way in which the Israelite nation coalesced. Yes, in part around the narrative of deliverance from Pharaoh, but also with a distinct sense of identity formed around a narrative of God's chosenness of the Israelite people and the mandated destruction of at least these seven nations. And I think one of the interesting questions to ask as we try and pivot back to, well, what does this teach us about intermarriage in the Jewish tradition? One could take a very narrow reading of this text and say, well, okay, this doesn't ban all intermarriage. It only bans these seven nations, right? It only bans intermarrying with these seven nations. And I think actually that comment is not just a rationalization around our discomfort with what the text tells us about our relations with non-Jews. I think it is actually literally true to the text that the intent of this text was to forbid relations with seven specific Canaanite nations that were residing in the land at this specific time. It does not necessarily imply that a marriage with a 21st century American Methodist is also subject to the same level of, divine displeasure. As for the subject of war and genocide, there's no way around that either. The biblical model, at least here, and it is not the only model. This is not the only legislation around warfare. It's very interesting. There was a powerful op-ed written by Rabbi Rick Jacobs, our emeritus and president of the Union for Reform Judaism, earlier this month, about denying humanitarian aid, specifically food, to the people of Gaza. Since then, by the way, I think that there's been a lot of debate and argument and scrutiny given to how much aid is actually getting in, how much of the aid is available to the citizens of Gaza as opposed to filling the storehouses of Hamas fighters and at penalty of death for any ordinary Gazan who tries to get it. Nevertheless, in Rabbi Jacob's article, he cited a law of warfare also from the book of Deuteronomy, I believe from chapter 21, which says when you wage war against your enemy, you must not cut down the fruit trees of your enemy's fields because they are a source of food. In other words, the point he wished to make is that there's a Jewish, or more accurately, an Israelite mandate against depriving or starving the enemy. Having said that, I mean that is both literally and figuratively, and yes, pun intended, that is cherry picking your biblical verses about how the Israelites were instructed to conduct war. To say that Israelites were instructed to conduct war in a way that is quote unquote humane or with the humanity of the enemy foremost in mind is, I think, an utterly disprovable claim. Okay, Linda, please.
I just want to say this is one of those sections of the Torah that makes you say, this is not my religion, not the religion I was raised with, and it is not. And I have a question. Are the Palestinian people the inheritors of any of those tribes, or do they relate back, or do we not know?
Right. So I'll say two things. First of all, I actually think that your comment, Linda, is a correct one. This is not our religion. We are
It's not.
not biblical Israelites. We are Jews. We're Reformed Jews at that. Obviously, these are our ancestors. And so I don't think we get to excommunicate our lineage on account of our discomfort with biblical practice or biblical legislation. And I should really clarify that there is a difference between what the Torah legislates and what text, scholarship, and archaeology demonstrates about lived practice. There's usually a lot of daylight between what the Torah is saying people should do and what the scholarly community, informed by Torah texts, but other texts and archaeological evidence, suggests might actually have been done. And one of the challenges of this text, by the way, is that in no way, shape, or form were the Canaanites displaced entirely from the land of Israel. At any point, there is also no archaeological or extra-textual, meaning texts outside the Torah itself, evidence that the Israelites ever constituted themselves as an army that committed genocide against the Canaanites. So that maybe that will comfort you, but it is not your religion. The rabbis who have, I think, dictated the shape, the contours, the details and depth of Jewish life for the last 2,000 years were also uncomfortable with these precepts and provided a much different pathway known as halakha for Jewish living. That pathway, as I've emphasized many times in our study, and I think feel pressed to do so again now, was informed by being a demilitarized society without political or military, without political sovereignty, right? Rabbinic Judaism is growing up alongside nascent Christianity at a time where the dominant regional power was the Roman Empire. And under this imperium, Jews were at best a vassal people with no real ability to govern themselves without being subject to the laws of the state. So they didn't have an army, they didn't have political power, or what political power they had was exercised through diplomacy. And in the best of times, the rabbinic community was able to carve out principalities where they could say, hey, the Jewish people just want to live by our own laws and practices. Would you let us alone, please? And again, variously at times in Jewish history under the Roman Imperium, Jews managed to, if not thrive, then survive under these conditions. And that, again, for most of Jewish history, our story is one of managing as a community under a much more powerful entity that governs, whether the power of the state, the power of the church, or some unholy admixture of the two. Um, so, mom and dad.
I'm reading this just a little bit differently, maybe in regard to the fact of getting immersed in the history of World War II a little bit more, following a visit to Normandy, thinking about your grandfather, who we presume was present in the taking of Iwo Jima. I think that maybe this is an admonition from the Holy One to tell the Jews, to tell his people, don't underestimate what war is.
Hmm.
That when you get down to it and you take the land, this is what war is. War is total devastation. And it's kind of a prescient thought. What it will take is the, total commitment to total devastation of your enemy. That's what war requires.
Thank you. Hard to argue with that. I mean, the way in which Deuteronomy in particular talks about war, and in a sense, the way Deuteronomy is placed in the biblical corpus, in the biblical canon, is as a preamble to war, the book of Joshua being entirely about war. I think that it could be understood as a warning, as an admonition about the reality of war. And that in order to wage war successfully, the Israelites are going to have to be hardened to its inhumanity as an enterprise. And with that, there are still, I think, texts that are, have a lot of they have longevity in Jewish memory, that war is still not a no holds barred enterprise, which is why I say there are these counter prevailing texts, whether it's about not cutting down your enemy's fruit trees. There are certain, I don't think that the language of crime is used, but certainly the present day Israeli military code would provide that war is not every man for himself, do whatever you want, inflict maximum pain upon the enemy. And yet, the dominant theme here is total devastation. But I wonder how both of these can be true. Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, so my observation here is that, can you hear me?
Yes.
That this particular war that we're talking about in Deuteronomy 7 is unprovoked. I mean, we're going into a land and they don't share the same values as the Israelites do. And they're being destroyed, whether the people, so we're sort of being the aggressors here. But then there are other types of wars, which are more of wars of vengeance, like the Amalekites, and in the Book of Esther, when things are turned around, we go against our enemies. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on, these different type of wars and why. I've been going to an Orthodox synagogue more recently, actually, and the remembrance of the Amalekites, which don't even exist anymore, is treated with a lot of passion, quite surprisingly. I'm trying to understand why there's so why this passion about the getting rid of the memory of the Amalekites when they're not here anymore. So I just wonder if you could comment on these different type of wars and why we're obsessed with destroying our enemy.
Yeah, well, that could be a whole semester. So I'll answer briefly, but I just would comment on the insight that's already evident in your question. So look, I think that from the standpoint of biblical Judaism, in other words, only from within the Torah's own perspective, the land always belonged to the Israelites by divine mandate. And so it is an injustice of sorts that these Canaanite nations are residing there. So that, not to rehash the arguments you can find in the comment section of your favorite social media platform these days, but there's still a war of words being waged here over who are the original owners, or at least residents would be a word that's more accurate than owners, since biblical land is not, the Bible's view of land is not that it is owned, but rather that people reside upon it, all at God's behest. The whole thing belongs to God. And therefore, it is God's will that the Israelite nation possess this land. End of story. I mean, this is, for lack of a better word, the cherem, or this total biblical war, is roughly equivalent to the military version of jihad. It's a holy war waged in the name of God for the purpose of producing an Israelite community in the land of God's choosing that is total. It is parallel in that way to the Muslim notion of ummah, or the idea that there must be an Islamic caliphate, which is why, in the eyes of Islamofascists like Hamas or ISIS or any number of other organizations that subscribe to a very similar ideologies informed by the most extreme versions of Islam, the presence of a Jewish sovereign power in what ought to be, I'm using that word in quotes or italics, Muslim Holy Land, is a grave offense, not just against the Muslim people, but against Allah, which is just the Arabic word for Elohim, or God. So you have to accept, first and foremost, that this idea of war that is waged in God's name. Now, having said that, the medieval rabbis, most famously Maimonides, would later classify different kinds of war on a scale of wars that are both necessary and indeed commanded by God, which are called milchemet mitzvah. Those are wars of Jewish survival, right? So where the survival of the Jewish people is at stake, it is not just permissible to wage war, but commanded according to what I would say is contemporary, meaning today's Jewish law derived all the way down from Maimonides 800 some odd years ago. The war since October 7th has, by most Orthodox poskim, most Orthodox, exegetes who are tasked with parsing Jewish morality through the lens of halakha, Orthodox poskim believe that the war that Israel is currently waging is still a milchemet mitzvah. It's a war that Israel must fight because it's existential. And I think they would retroactively, of course, classify the war of Deuteronomy 7 similarly as a milchemet mitzvah, just because you have this freed slave population that they can't subsist in the Sinai desert. And by the way, again, the biblical view is that despite the fact that there are foreigners living there, they are still foreigners. That is not their land. We, from the 21st century lens, could say, wait a second, archaeology tells a very different story. The more likely story is that the Canaanites were there first. And therefore, the idea of who are the foreigners? Well, the foreigners could be these escaped slaves, Israelites, who came in and conquered. However, the real story is probably that the Israelites arose from within Canaan. Like, if we really want to get into what today's scholars of the ancient Near East believe, they do not believe in a massive invasion by 600,000 armed men who had formerly been slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. What most scholars believe is that an indigenous tribe from among the Canaanite civilization arose and adopted a narrative of escaping from Egypt as slaves. These people, known as Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, had their own relationship with gods, both Canaanite and their own god, who came to be known as Yahweh, who might have been a moon god. Like, there's a whole bunch of, like, really, if you want to go back to proto-Israelite history, most scholars believe that the Egypt narrative, the Exodus narrative, is the master story of the Israelite nation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it happened the way they say it happened. So the other kinds of wars in the Maimonidean classification, so I'll just give you two. There's a Milchemet Mitzvah, which is a war you must fight, and then there's a Milchemet Reshut, which is a war that you may fight. So, for instance, under King David, certain wars were against the Philistines were Milchemet Mitzvah. There was an enemy threatening to destroy the Israelites. David and his armies had to fight them to survive. But what about continuing the wars under David that expanded Israelite territory? That might be classified as a Milchemet Reshut, a war that you may fight. A war that is designed to, for instance, conquering the Golan Heights in Gaza, right? Do we need those perimeters in order to secure the vast majority of Jewish people living in Israel? That's debatable, but it's probably halachically permissible. And then, of course, there are wars that are not legitimate at all. If it is a totally unprovoked war of aggression initiated by the Jews, there's no halacha that permits that. I'm not saying it isn't happening or doesn't happen. I don't think that today's war is that kind of a war. We're getting into some pretty gray areas these days, by the way. I mean, you could argue that on October 8th, it was a Milchemet Mitzvah. A year later, it was a Milchemet Reshut, and I don't know what it is today. What kind of a war is this? Depends on who you ask. Okay, we're going to move forward. Unless Judy Starts has a comment.
Thank you.
That's a different Judy. That's Judy Lass, right? So you have your microphone off, a microphone on, Judy. Do you want to comment? We can't hear you. So that's something on your end. I'm gonna advise that you try to address that, but if you can't, I'm sorry. Okay, I want to go back to the text here about intermarriage. Simply put, deriving from Deuteronomy chapter 7, the baseline position for almost all of Jewish history is that intermarriage, meaning marriage between a Jew and any Gentile, is absolutely forbidden under halacha. Therefore, to this day, you will not find an Orthodox rabbi that I know of, or even a conservative rabbi who is affiliated with an Orthodox or conservative movement who will perform an intermarriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. Full stop. That can't happen because Orthodoxy is firmly committed to the overriding force of halakha, of Jewish law, as traditionally interpreted through the rabbis. Conservative Judaism is also at least nominally committed to the binding force of halakha, though conservative Judaism endeavors to have its halakha in constant dialogue with the demands of modernity. But when the conservative movement issues a rabbinic ruling, usually through JTS, the seminary, which has more authority than the Reform Seminary does in terms of dictating what the movement advises its clergy and congregants to do. In conservative Judaism, the seminary can come up with halachic workarounds, but it always derives these through a process of negotiation from within the halakha. And as of today, the conservative movement has not come around to using halachic grounds to validate solemnizing vows of marriage between Jews and non-Jews. In 2018, the conservative movement did grant permission to conservative rabbis, I don't know about cantors, but conservative rabbis, to be present for interfaith weddings. In other words, before 2018, conservative rabbis were told by the authority of the seminary, JTS, you can't even show up because that would signal a tacit assent to the marriage. After 2018, conservative rabbis were given permission. Again, that language makes sense in my movement. It does not make sense. We don't operate that way. But rabbis in the conservative movement as of 2018 were given permission to show up at interfaith weddings, not to solemnize them, not to conduct them, not to officiate, but to show up for the sake of the family. If you have a relationship with a family and you want to say, I can't do this ceremony as an ambassador of the conservative movement and the Jewish tradition as understood in conservative Judaism, but I can show up for you as your rabbi because I love you and I care about you. That's the conservative movement's present day approach. But what about Reform Judaism, which has never subscribed to the overriding authority of halakha? Well, let's take one more look at some text here. Actually, I'm not going to look at it because I think it will weigh us down and prevent us from getting to the meaty stuff I want to. I did prepare some text to look at from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are from the Ketuvim, or the writings section of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, and they actually provide us with a window into a narrative about a lived experience of the Jewish people at the time that we were reconstituting ourselves as a commonwealth under the authority of the Persians at the end of the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonian exile, which took place in the first part of the 6th century BCE, Babylonian conquest of Judah, exile of the aristocracy, and the formation of an exilic community of Jews in what is today Iraq, then the Empire of Babylonia, later overthrown by Koresh, or Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, who was more permissive vis-a-vis the Jews and allowed them to return to Judea to reconstitute a commonwealth, not exactly self-governing in that they would have their own governorship, but it would ultimately be they would have to answer to the Persians. And they would be, most significantly, granted permission to rebuild their temple. As part of it, Ezra, who becomes the chief religious official, and Nehemiah, who becomes the chief political official for this effort to reconstitute a Jewish community in Israel, in Judah, after the Babylonian exile. So we're now in the late part of the 6th century, early 5th century BCE. These efforts were combined with strict admonitions against intermarriage. So if you read Ezra 8, 9, and 10, the last 3 chapters of the book of Ezra, which is in kind of like the outfield of the Bible, if you go to your table contents, go way down, and read the book of Nehemiah, you will see that prohibitions against intermarriage were enacted, and intermarriage was blamed as the chief reason the Israelites had strayed from the purity of their worship of Adonai. So, in other words, without direct reference to Deuteronomy 7, it's clear that something had sunk in by the post-exilic period for Jews. And we can refer to them as Jews at this point because they were the exilic Judeans, or Jews, who had been part of the Babylonian civilization for 70 years or so before coming back, now with the understanding or the self-identity as Jews. These Jews, by this point, had absorbed the understanding that intermarriage was bad and that it was a gross affront to God and that it shouldn't be done. And that was turned into state policy, as it were, under Ezra and Nehemiah. So read those books. They're really interesting. They're very sharp about, the debilitating effect of intermarriage on the religious community. For exactly the reasons that Deuteronomy outlines, it's going to cause your children, if it's going to dilute Judaism. That would be the language we would use today. If you intermarry, they will worship foreign gods. But we would say, analogously, it will dilute Judaism, right? That you'll have fewer and fewer Jews. I once heard a lecture by Shimon Peres of blessed memory, the great Israeli statesman, and dovish Labor Party leader, who always believed in a two-state solution, really to his dying day. Peres was once asked, what's his definition of a Jew? Which, of course, has always been a burning topic, especially in the Jewish state, which ironically has multiple definitions of Judaism and Jews for different purposes, from the law of return, which is actually very liberal, to the Orthodox rabbinate, which is very, very strict. But Peres's answer was neither kowtowing to the law of return nor to the Orthodox rabbinate. He said a Jew is a person whose grandchildren are Jewish. Well, that's a pretty high bar, particularly for us Reform Jews. Okay, Ann Cohen, you have your hand raised. You may unmute yourself. All right, while that's waiting to happen, Mom and Dad, you want to make a comment?
I think one thing to be brought forward from Mom and my growing up was the shanda that was associated with intermarriage. I mean, it wasn't just a neutral thing, kind of the way it is now. Well, she married a Jew, she didn't marry a Jew, etc. This was, like, oh no, they can't have a religious wedding. They're going to have to go to a justice of the peace. What's going to happen to that family? They're going to have a Christmas tree. I mean, it was really a cause for being scorned socially.
Hold that thought, please. Hold that thought, because you're going to find some real textual support for that position. Okay. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to share another tab before we get to some more modern texts. But I want you to understand the halachic view of intermarriage. And that is provided through a short passage from Tractate Kiddushin in the Babylonian Talmud. So the question is asked, Nochriya minalan. So a nochriya literally means it's another Hebrew word, nochrit, meaning a Gentile woman. Minalan. Where do we derive that a marriage to a Gentile woman is invalid? A lot of this, as in most Talmudic writing, is highly elliptical. In other words, pieces seem to be missing and the syntax seems to be abbreviated or truncated. You have to read the previous passages to understand the conversation. They're really talking about the Jewish status of children from various marriages that are not one Jew plus another Jew. Okay, that's the broad category that this section of Kiddushin, which we've looked at a lot over the last many weeks, because it's one of the chief Talmudic tractates that takes up the subject of Jewish marriage. The title actually means marriage. Kiddushin, remember, sanctification and marriage are the same word in rabbinic Judaism. So what do we do in the case of a Gentile woman? And what the larger conversation will provide, that marrying a Gentile woman, they use the word ineffective. Ineffective in the sense that it has no halachic standing, right? There is no such thing as intermarriage in Judaism. I know you're saying, wait a minute, Rabbi, but Jewish people do this all the time. That's not the point. This isn't about lived practice. This is about the provisions of halakha, the provisions of the law. And halakha does not actually provide for a legitimate marriage between a Gentile and a Jew. Therefore, what to make of their offspring, well, that's what this passage is all about. So, Amar Kara, the scripture says, the text of the Torah says, Lo titchaten bam. This is from Deuteronomy 7. We looked at this. Do not intermarry with them. That word titchaten, meaning marriage, but coming from chatan. I've highlighted the root, meaning groom. Don't marry them. It's a biblical edict. And in the Talmud, you can see we're no longer narrowing the frame to just these 7 Canaanite nations, but rather any Gentile. So the term here would be a nochrit, a Gentile woman. The Torah says, "Lo titchaten bam." You can't make marriages with them. Ashkachna de la tafsibach kidushe. So literally that means we have found ashkachna. We've derived de la tafseba kidushe. Literally, a marriage with a Gentile woman doesn't hold. Lo tafsi. Tafsi or tafas means to capture or grab or catch. So it doesn't hold, right? A marriage with a Gentile woman doesn't hold. There's no halachic standing for it. Viladach kimota minalan. So where do we derive that any offspring that comes from this marriage is like her? Meaning, if a Gentile woman marries a Jewish man, first of all, they're saying, well, it's not Kiddushin. That is not a Jewish marriage. We will talk in a few minutes about the civil authorities that in today's world, and for a long time previous, govern the institutions of marriage according to the law of the state. But the Talmud doesn't take that up as its consideration. The Talmud is only concerned with what is a Jewish marriage. And basically, the takeaway from this text is a marriage between a Jew and a Gentile is not a Jewish marriage. It's not marriage the way Jews understand it. In order to be marriage, it has to be 2 Jews. And therefore, any offspring that are produced between a Jewish man and a Gentile woman are, it says, kimotah. That's the word I've highlighted. They are like her, meaning the children follow the identity of the mother. Now, this is true today, right? According to halakha, Jewish man marries non-Jewish woman, they have kids. What's the status of the child? Not Jewish. You all know that. So this is actually the Talmudic proof for that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, de Amar Kara, we appeal to the text which says, Ki asir et bincha me'acharai, also from Deuteronomy 7, for they will turn away your sons from following me. Bincha abba mi Israelit karui bincha, a child who comes from an Israelite woman is called your son. In other words, is a Jew. And you know this too, right? Jewish man marries Jewish woman. What's the status of the child? Jewish. Non-Jewish man marries Jewish woman. What's the status of the child? Jewish. Not a legitimate marriage, but the offspring follows the mother. It goes on to say, Ve'en bincha ba min hanochrit. But there is no such thing as a Jewish son being born to a Gentile woman being called your son, meaning a child of the Jewish people. Ela binah. Rather, he follows her. So this is the part of the Torah that establishes matrilineal descent, as opposed to the biblical model, which is de facto patrilineal, right? Nobody asks about the status of, for instance, Joseph's children. Joseph married an Egyptian priestess, right? Nobody questions that Joseph's own children, Manasseh and Ephraim, are Jewish. And if you doubt it, they're blessed by Jacob as inheritors to the Israelite destiny in the final chapters of the book of Genesis. So even though Joseph married a Gentile, it's pretty clear that the status of Joseph's children follow the father as an Israelite. And again, none of this is governed by halakha. This is all just biblical narrative, biblical law, which is pre-halachic. Additionally, the status of being a Kohen is patrilineally conveyed. right? The Kohen, the priestly identity, is conferred from fathers to their children, not through the mother's line. But it seems that both for pragmatic reasons, like establishing paternity before DNA testing is impossible. So in the world of the Talmud, in the world of the ancient rabbis, there's no way to establish paternity, but maternity is always established. We always know who a child's mother is. Therefore, for a pragmatic reason, it seems also as well as a desire to uphold the nuance of Deuteronomy 7, the Talmud affirms that the status of the child follows the mother, whether Christian or whether Jewish or non-Jewish. Okay, that's the basic idea behind Kiddushin 68b. And did you figure out how to turn your
Yes.
microphone on?
Can you
Okay, here
hear
we go.
me?
We hear you. Yes.
My cousin, a Jewish woman, married a Catholic, and the wedding was conducted by, at the same time, wedding was conducted by both a priest and a rabbi, and the children are brought up Jewish.
Yep. This is actually pretty commonplace these days. Pretty clear that that was not an Orthodox rabbi, and definitely not a conservative rabbi. And only a small percentage of Reform rabbis will consent to conduct a service alongside a Catholic priest. But it does happen. It does happen. And of course, there are plenty of rabbis who don't affiliate with a movement, who are not beholden to a synagogue, an institution, or a board, who are just, well, disparagingly, we could call them rent-a rabbis, but they're just, non-congregational rabbis operating in the field. How does it follow with a surrogate mother? So that's a question that came through the text, and both Barbara's question about Ruth is relevant here as well. Ruth, so Ruth, you might remember, is a Moabite woman. She is a Moabitess. And yet, by the end of the story of Ruth, the end of the book of Ruth, which we'll be reading in just a few days for Shavuot, Ruth is married to Boaz. And Boaz is an Israelite. Boaz is a Jewish man. So, what is the status of Ruth's children? Well, the book ends with a genealogy that establishes that not only is Ruth a legitimate matriarch among the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition, she goes on to be the ancestor, the direct ancestor, like great 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 grandmother of King David himself. So Ruth is understood by the rabbinic tradition to be the paradigmatic convert. And the way in which that is established is by her verbal declaration spoken to her Moabite mother-in-law, Naomi. She says, "Wheresoever thou goest, I shall go." I don't know why I'm speaking biblical. "Wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you are buried, there will I be buried," etc., and so forth. That declaration, which we looked at this fall, by the way, when we did a short class, a session on conversion in the Jewish tradition, that declaration becomes the paradigm for conversion in the Jewish tradition. So Ruth, by the end of the story, is not a Gentile, even though they don't have like mikveh and the rituals of conversion that the rabbinic community would establish. Ruth is considered legitimately a member of the Jewish people by reason of conversion, and therefore any future children from the line of Ruth are legitimately Jewish. It is fascinating, though, that David does derive from the paradigmatic convert in the Jewish tradition. And surrogacy, so let's take the case of a Jewish couple. Jewish man, Jewish woman want to have a child for whatever reason, can't have children biologically between the two of them, and so they approach a surrogate and they do legal surrogacy, right? But the biological mother is not Jewish. In such instances, there's a very simple workaround. The child is not illegitimate, by the way. The child is totally legitimate. The child is just not born Jewish. So you take the child to the mikveh at some point in infancy, or even as a toddler, when you don't have to like test the kid for Jewish knowledge before they enroll in religious school. So, and you can dunk a kid in a mikveh any old day of the week. Like it's a beautiful thing. I've done it dozens, if not hundreds of times. And so that's usually what is done in the case of surrogacy or adoption. Um, if the surrogate, by the way, or the biological mother is Jewish for a surrogacy or adoption, then you don't need to go to the mikveh because the child is Jewish. And that same passage we were just looking at in Kiddushin in the Talmud establishes that if you have a Jewish woman married to a non-Jewish man, the child is Jewish even though the father is not Jewish, the child still takes on the Jewish status and is not an illegitimate child. Anyway, the only case of illegitimacy, or what's known as mamzerut, the condition of being a mamzer, that only arises when a woman marries somebody she's not allowed to marry. For instance, somebody who is already married to somebody else and who has not given a get. Right. So that's where the question of illegitimacy comes in. And that's why last week's session is relevant, that if a woman wants to marry and have children with a second or another husband, she must receive a get first from the first husband. Otherwise, any future progeny from her next marriage will not be legitimate. That's where illegitimacy comes in. But in the case of non-Jews marrying Jews, it's different because it was never a marriage to begin with. I guess that's the main takeaway I want you to get, that according to halakha, according to Jewish law, according to the Talmud itself, it isn't a marriage. Therefore, there's nothing to annul. There is no get required either. It wasn't a marriage to begin with. Okay, Joe Levine.
In one of your last scenarios, Jewish woman whose father is a Levite, who's a Levi, marries a non-Jew. They have children. Let's say two boys. Are the boys Levites also? How do we describe them?
I would need to look that one up. I'm inclined to say they're not. Obviously, in the Reform community, if it were important to the Jewish mother and the kid were being raised Jewish and they wanted the kid to have a Levite identity, I would probably just say, well, this is part of your family heritage. But is the child a Levite? I don't think so. But give me a week to come back to you on that, Joe. It's actually a good question. If we were playing Stump the Rabbi, 1 point for Joe today. Okay, I'd like to return to our text, and now we're going to jump to the modern era, though nothing that is so new that it will feel familiar. So, I went on the website of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. That's the Reform Rabbinate. And I looked up a number of responsa, which we discussed last week, which are letters written by rabbis or sometimes by laity to an authority. In the case of the Reform movement, there's a responsa committee. But the enterprise of reviving this medieval custom of asking questions of a rabbinic authority and receiving answers that are rooted in halakha and also lived Jewish practice, Jewish custom, a new vast corpus of really important Jewish literature is created. And again, under the direction of Solomon Freehoff and his protege, Rabbi Walter Jacob, these two great American 20th century Reform rabbis, basically, Freehoff single-handedly revived a medieval custom. And much of what Reform Judaism thinks and says and believes about a certain position or certain issue can actually be discovered through this archive of responsa, which is available to the public, by the way. Just go on the website of the CCAR and look up responsa, and they have like tons of them. You can also buy these in volumes in printed books from the CCAR press. My little pitch for CCAR press. Okay, so this we won't get to all of them today. We'll probably pick this up next week. We'll continue intermarriage, and then we'll end the unit of study for the spring on gay marriage, which is great. That'll be like an appendix. But intermarriage is really a complicated subject into and of itself. So we're going to start here. As you can see, this comes from a collection that was compiled, I believe, in 1982, called American Reform Responsa. And we have here a responsum that was composed by none other than this fellow here. I've highlighted his name, K. Kohler, Kaufmann Kohler, who was Isaac Mayer Wise's direct successor as the president of the Hebrew Union College and the head of the CCAR. He was a very, very important late 19th century, early 20th century Reform rabbi. Let's see what Kaufmann Kohler does with this question. So from 1919, can everyone see that I'm going to highlight the key points here as we go? On October 30th, 1918, and it doesn't say, it's Kaufmann Kohler, this rabbi, head of the Reform movement at the time, is describing a letter. He doesn't say who it's from, but the letter goes like this. I have been asked by a Jewish, so it's clearly from a rabbi in the movement. I have been asked by a Jewish gentleman of my congregation to unite him in wedlock with a Gentile. Is it compatible with Judaism for a rabbi to perform such a marriage when the Gentile does not accept the Jewish religion? And is it in keeping with his position and dignity as rabbi to perform such a marriage when the Gentile does not accept the Jewish faith? So the rabbi is asking, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to solemnize a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? Secondly, can a rabbi consistently perform such a marriage in the capacity of a layman without lending it the religious sanction as a rabbi? In other words, can the rabbi just say, I'm not a rabbi for the sake of this marriage, I'm just an official of the state? And this is where we get back to something I mentioned earlier today. I'll come back to the text in a moment just so you can see my face here. The way in which I exercise authority at weddings is actually as a licensed solemnizer of New York State. That's my only authority to conduct weddings that are legally valid in the United States. Now, New York, as I've probably mentioned to you several times before, is pretty stringent in its qualifications for who can be a solemnizer. Many states, California most notably, I can literally get off a plane, not provide any identification, and just marry two people, fill out a form, and send it back to the state, and it's a legitimate marriage. In New York, you actually have to prove that you are who you say you are and that you are authorized to solemnize weddings in that state. I've mentioned this before. So what this rabbi is asking Kohler is, okay, well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I wanted to marry this couple, but I won't be doing it as their rabbi. I'll be doing it as a civil official. And even today, most marriage licenses, which are provided by the state, or sometimes even by the local authority, like the village clerk of Scarsdale, has a marriage license form that looks different from the one that the city clerk of New York provides. It's bonkers because they're all under the state jurisdiction, but they're different forms. So what the rabbi's asking is, can I just show up as a civil officiant? And you have to check a box on most marriage licenses today that say, are you conducting a religious marriage or a civil marriage? So if I were a justice of the peace, I could conduct a civil marriage. Carol, you're with us today, right? I saw you earlier. Is Carol Prince Levy here? Carol, you've done weddings before, right? Unmute yourself if you're able. In your capacity as a judge.
No, I've never done it.
But you could, right?
Good.
Yeah. You're legally authorized to. Sandy, what about you? You were a judge. Did you ever do weddings? I don't know if Sandy's still with us. Her screen seems frozen. Okay. Eve, anyone else? Anyone else have the legal authority to solemnize weddings? Jay, you've done weddings? Wait,
When I was town justice.
Oh, okay. So in your capacity as town justice, you would
That was
conduct
a long time ago.
right. So even if you were marrying two Jews, you would still be doing a civil wedding. Because
Yes.
it's about the specific authority of the solemnizer. It's not about the couple. Okay. So in this case, so that's the sheila, or the question that the rabbi is asking Kohler, the big rabbi. Okay, let's see what Kohler says. To this I replied. So this is the section we're looking at. Unless the person whom a Jew or Jewess is to marry adopts in some form the Jewish religion, after having learned its tenets in order to know what the steps taken by him or her mean, no rabbi who wants to be true to the tradition of Judaism can perform the marriage ceremony. Or that's his answer. His answer is a very hard no. Though he does say, no, if the non-Jewish partner wants to convert, yes, is implied, but unless that happens, no. And he cites a book by the great Reform Jewish scholar of the 19th century, Moses Milziner. Every Reform rabbinical student in Cincinnati had to read a lot of Kaufman Kohler and Moses Milziner. As may be learned from Dr. Milziner's book, The Jewish Law of Marriage and Divorce, pages 45 to 54, and he's a little shameless self-promotion here, and from my book, Jewish Theology, page 446, in which the resolutions passed by the Conference of 1909, so that's the CCAR, my organizing body, are referred to. So in other words, as of 1909, and here 10 years later, Kaufman Kohler is saying nothing has changed, Reform rabbis should not be doing interfaith marriages. As to the question whether a rabbi can, in the capacity of a layman, consecrate mixed marriage, let me simply say that neither Judaism nor the state law acknowledges such a marriage as legal. In a second letter, which stated that the gentleman in question expressed his surprise at the narrowness of Judaism and contemplated going to a Christian minister to be married by him. So in other words, Kohler wrote the letter back. The rabbi told his congregants, sorry, I can't do it. The guy said, really? Isn't Judaism this beautiful, inclusive tradition? Maybe I'll just get a Christian clergy person to do the wedding. Here's the response. The writer asked whether there was, quote, no possibility of performing the marriage when the assurance is given that the non-Jew will accept the Jewish faith after the marriage, and whether the rabbi can perform the marriage of both non-Jews. So what he's saying is here, well, what if there's a promise to convert later? What if the woman just says, no, you got to marry us now, but I'm going to be Jewish. Don't worry about it. That's what he came back. And Kohler's response to this, I answered, no matter whether said member thinks Judaism is too narrow for him or not, the question is whether religion or he who represents it stands for a certain principle or not. He's like, come on, we have principles here. Certainly the Jewish home, which is the object of marriage, must be conducted according to the Jewish principles. In other words, you want a Jewish home, everyone's got to be Jewish. A Christian minister cannot consecrate a Jewish home, nor can a Jewish minister consecrate a Christian home. And if man and wife belong to two different religions, it will be a house divided against itself. Without harmony of views in a matter so vital to the future, there is no real unity. For those who think that the Jewish home needs no religious consecration, the state law provides that they may apply to the civil magistrate to perform the marriage and have the sanction of the state for their union, Kaufman Kohler. So what he's saying is, look, if they're not down with being Jewish, both partners, it's not going to be a Jewish home, and they should get a civil marriage instead. The state should solemnize this, but a rabbi should not. Now, that was 106 years ago, right? So let's take a peek at some more. And by the way, this comes from the same page on the website. I just looked up mixed marriage or intermarriage, and the website did the rest. Okay. This was not, the case was never closed until it was. Okay, rabbi officiating at a mixed marriage. As you can see, this is from 1982. Would there be any halachic justification for a rabbi officiating at an intermarriage? What reasons, halachic and non-halachic, for refusal can be cited? Not from a rabbi, but it's from a Mr. Rabbi. No, Mr. RBI. Guy has a lot of runs batted in. From New York, New York. All right, so Mr. Rabbi from New York City. Answer. It is clear from the committee's earlier responsum on Reform Judaism and mixed marriage that there can be no halachic basis for a mixed marriage. Okay, that, by the way, I agree with that statement entirely. I officiate at mixed marriages some of the time, not under all circumstances, but under many. But I don't justify it as a halachic practice. But as a Reformed Jew, there are lots of things we do that are not derived from halacha. Let's go on. That responsum from CCAR Yearbook 1980, that's where it was collected. So in other words, this question has been asked many times, and even by the early 80s, they affirm, the CCAR affirms, there is no halachic basis for a mixed marriage. The responsa presents a long and detailed history of mixed marriage and the halachic arguments. The last resolution of the conference, passed in Atlanta in 1973, clearly states the position of the conference. Quote, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, recalling its stand adopted in 1909, so we're appealing to the same resolution that Kaufman-Kohler mentioned in 1919, states that mixed marriage is contrary to the Jewish tradition and should be discouraged. The same conference now, 9 years later, declares its opposition to participation by its members, in 1973, declares its opposition to participation by its members in any ceremony which solemnizes mixed marriage. So this was from the year I was born, right? This is from 1973. The Central Conference of American Rabbis recognizes that historically its members have held and continue to hold divergent interpretations of Jewish tradition. In order to keep open every channel to Judaism and Klal Yisrael, meaning the unity of the Jewish people or the collective of the Jews, for those who have already entered into mixed marriage, in other words, if we know that there are many people in our midst who are already in these marriages, the CCAR calls upon its members, 1, to assist fully in educating children of such mixed marriages as Jews, 2, to provide the opportunity for conversion of the non-Jewish spouse, and 3, to encourage a creative and consistent cultivation of involvements in the Jewish community and synagogue. Let's welcome these people, but let's make them feel more at home and do more to educate them and embrace them and provide them with the tools to live Jewishly. All right, that's what it's saying. The position of the halacha and its development through the ages is outlined in the earlier responsum. So he's saying, I'm not going to answer that question because you can go back and read. We've already responded to that question. However, as this question is interested in the contemporary arguments which might be useful in a discussion of the matter, let us suggest the following. So now we're going to go outside of strict halacha. We're not going to look at Deuteronomy 7. We're not going to look at Kiddushin 68b. We're going to cite arguments that are non-halachic, but which still may be compelling. And this is really an important feature of Reform Responsa, because it's not just what does the halacha say, it's go and see what the Jews are doing. All right, let's see what the arguments are in this case. The rabbi is a misader kiddushin, which means the one who solemnizes weddings. The organizer of the ceremony, as I have taught in the last few weeks, acts in a legal capacity not only for the state but also for Judaism. Judaism has always held that only two Jews can be married to each other through a religious ceremony performed by a rabbi. This would not preclude a civil ceremony nor a ceremony performed by the couples themselves as permitted in Pennsylvania. So there are some states that don't even, at least at the time this was written, require a solemnizer to show up. And that is consistent with Judaism. You don't need an outside party to solemnize the vows. Just the bride and the groom and the witnesses have to take care of the words and the ketubah and the ring and the chuppah. Such ceremonies can and frequently do contain prayers, but they are obviously not kiddushin. They are not legal Jewish marriage, nor could they be even if performed by a rabbi, as kiddushin between a Jew and a non-Jew would be a contradiction in terms. That's the word that the Talmud uses. It's ineffective. I don't love ineffective, but it's like it doesn't exist. It's a non-thing in Judaism. A Jewish ceremony, Point 2, a Jewish ceremony performed for one individual who is Jewish and another who is non-Jewish violates the conscience of the rabbi and infringes upon the rights of the non-Jewish party and his or her religious affiliation. Furthermore, even if he or she would agree to such a ceremony, he or she could not in good conscience say, quote, they're talking about he or she meaning the bride or groom, be consecrated unto me as my wife or husband, I'm going to put boldface here, according to the laws of Moses in Israel, as the non-Jewish partner, he or she, has not accepted these laws. In other words, when you take the actual vow, the vow draws its authority on, quote, Dat Moshe Yisrael. Kedat Moshe Yisrael, I marry you with this ring according to the law of Moses in Israel. But if you're a non-Jew, how can you say those words? By the way, just my own editorial here, as a Reform rabbi who does occasionally officiate at interfaith weddings, I just don't have them say those words. But Reform Judaism has always come up with new words, like we changed the avot v'imahot to include the matriarchs. So I don't understand why we can't just have the bride and groom say something else rather than I marry thee according to the law of Moses and Israel. Just say, thou art betrothed to me, or, ani lidodi v'dodi li. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. But I'm an English major. I have a pretty, I believe in poetry. Like the words mean what we assign the meaning to them to be. Okay. But that's my editorial. That is not part of the responsum. I apologize for sermonizing. Okay. So you can't have them, according to this responsum written over 40 years ago, you can't have them say, according to the law of Moses and Israel, when they put a ring on it, because they do not abide by, the non-Jew does not accept the law of Moses and Israel. 3, it is the task of the rabbi to strengthen Judaism in the Jewish community. Here's where things get really interesting. Mixed marriage tends to weaken these ties. It raises doubts about the couple's will to remain a Jewish family or to assure that future offspring will be Jewish. Even if their children are circumcised, named in the synagogue, or some effort is made to raise them as Jews, this is still not as effective as raising children in a Jewish household in which both parties actively participate in Jewish ceremonies. I'm not convinced that I disagree with this. I am also not convinced that both husband and wife, look, I've seen way too many successful families where one parent is Jewish and the other parent is pro-Jewish. I believe I have sufficient anecdotal evidence from my own 25 years in the rabbinate that disproves this claim. But okay, I'm sorry, I'm editorializing again. I said I wouldn't do that. Let's read. Judaism is a religion of the home and the family, with emphasis upon the atmosphere of the home and upon the influence of extended family. Therefore, it is important that there be a minimum of confusion between the couple and their in-laws about the Jewishness of the home. After a mixed marriage, the couple certainly may agree to raise their children as Jews. A Reform congregation would encourage such an agreement, permit these children to attend the religious school, and encourage the Jewish partner to join the congregation. Most Reform Jews would consider the children Jewish as long as they affiliate in some fashion and do not accept another religion. Very important. We're going to get to this next week. This was written 1 year before the movement officially adopted the position of accepting patrilineal descent. So you can see it's leaning that way strongly already. In 1982, in 1983, our movement resolved, and I have that text for us, but we won't get to it this week. Yet we also realize that their Judaism might well be, there's the word I was looking for, diluted through the problems of a religiously mixed home. 4, the agreement to officiate intermarriages would be a clear signal to others in the community, especially children, that this matter of indifference or less than paramount, that this is a matter of indifference or less than paramount concern to the rabbi. In other words, rabbinic assent, rabbis showing up and doing these weddings, will lead the community to conclude that it's really not a big deal for non-Jews to marry Jews. I'm not convinced that I would argue against that. It very well may. I know anecdotally that once the rabbi agrees to do interfaith weddings, it releases some tension from the family conversation about it, but it also deprives parents who wish for their children to marry a Jew of a certain ammunition that previously they enjoyed having. They could say to their kids, well, you can marry Clarissa, but Rabbi Blake won't do the wedding. Or Rabbi Jacobs won't do the wedding. Once I assented to do that, parents no longer had that leverage. And therefore, they lost one possible disincentive. I'm very comfortable with them losing that disincentive. I do not think it is Jewishly healthy for families to be able to appeal to the rabbinic policy of the congregation to try and steer their children's choices in love and marriage. But that's again, I'm operating from the world of the 21st century and not the 20th century. Much has changed in the 43 years since this responsum was written. Carol, let's take your question, and then we'll have 5 more minutes to keep reading.
Okay. It doesn't say that it is not effective. It said it may not be as effective.
What's the it? The marriage meaning?
No, go back where it says the teaching or the mixed marriage.
Yes, correct.
It says
Uh,
it may not be, where is it? It is still not as effective. That
read
doesn't
the
mean it is not effective. It just
correct.
means it's not as effective.
That's right. Meaning if it's a mixed home.
It's a mixed home.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they don't look, what they're trying to do in the early 80s here, the movement was dealing with a real problem. The real problem meaning now we have a ton of families who, particularly after the kind of liberal upheavals of the 1960s, were and the successful assimilation of Jews into American society, we're dealing with a sharp uptick in interfaith marriages. And the Reform movement wanted these families to keep affiliating in their congregations. But there was no precedent at this time for Reform rabbis to be conducting such marriages. So, what do you do about rabbis who won't do interfaith weddings, but who the day after the wedding say, please join our congregation? Or you're already in our congregation and you're an interfaith household who's moved to our community, we embrace you. But when your kids get married, I won't do their wedding. Like that's the dilemma. And that actually was part of what arose from Rabbi Alexander Schindler, the then president of the UAHC, the Reform Movement synagogue arm, now the URJ, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Union for Reform Judaism. What Schindler devised as a massive program called Outreach, which was outreach to interfaith families, to intermarried couples and their households, and to help them feel included. But this really produced an upheaval in lots of ways. We'll look at next week, the rise of patrilineal descent and the gradual permissions that rabbis felt to conduct interfaith weddings, which now a majority of Reform rabbis do. Probably somewhere on the order of 76% of active Reform rabbis do officiated interfaith weddings, as opposed to at the time this was written, when it was probably about 15% or fewer. Mom and Dad?
Just to kind of contrast the way things I think were for mom and my parents' generation, where interfaith was really rare because there was so much familial pressure, community pressure not to do that sort of thing. I think that what really stung coming up to the 70s and 80s among the Jewish community, and maybe the rabbinate in particular, was the obvious point that we don't really care about the Judaism part of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
That rejection, not adhering to you can't marry, a non-Jew, was kind of like, well, this whole thing doesn't really matter to us. We're in love. We know what we're doing. And the Judaism, if we don't get that part, it's not really that important.
Right.
And I think that was really, very kind of like entirely new rejection among
I think
parents.
that's right. I think that's speaking to colleagues of, older generations, which I do with great friendship and reverence. I think I've heard stories that corroborate that point of view. There's a lovely response. If we have time next week, we'll look at it as well, which I also called up for today about, well, what about conducting a mixed marriage on temple premises? And I think that this was written in 1971. What's interesting about this one is not so much where they land, which I believe is a no, but they talk a lot about sitting Shiva for children who married outside the faith. And there's an acknowledgement that the shunning of couples who intermarry is not salubrious for the Jewish people and especially for Reform Jewish congregations. So I think that there's been a very long, meaning decades, generations even, long trend. I'm not going to call it a concerted effort, though that's part of it. There's been both an effort from the leadership, but also a trend from among the people not to sit Shiva for our children who choose to marry outside the faith, while still acknowledging the deep emotional wound that is inflicted when a child marries outside. Because, as you say, Dad, it does register for the parents, especially, but also for the rabbi and sometimes for the wider community as a rejection of what the community, the rabbi, and the parents have worked so hard to instill from birth,
You
right?
make Mom reminds me of Mel Berkowitz, who was the husband of the longtime caregiver and babysitter for you, who sat Shiva for his daughter
No, his son.
or his son for marrying outside of the faith, and this
Right.
was in 1970s.
That's right. Very common. And of course, in the Orthodox world, and especially the ultra-Orthodox world, that is still done. Karen, you'll get the last comment, and then I'll say a few remarks to conclude today's session.
Okay, well, this is a question. The question is, to what extent does modern Judaism consider the possibility of intermarriage, or at least the conservative welcoming process and educating process of newcomers as an opportunity to grow the religion, to grow not the religion, but grow the community, and do it in a very positive way, because these are motivated people. They're not of the mind to say, we don't need this. They might actually be saying, this is beautiful. I wish to follow these people. I wish to be at Sinai.
Beautiful and gorgeous. I love your poetic frame that leads us straight to Shavuot. So, Karen, I think I'll speak only for the Reform movement because I don't want to comment on how this plays out outside of my field of view. But the answer to your question is strongly. The Reform movement, particularly under Rick Jacobs, adopted pretty much as one of the main planks of his presidency of the Reform movement of the Union, a tenet known as audacious hospitality, which includes the idea that we will grow and strengthen our congregations by being the most inclusive living stream of Judaism. That means people who live with disabilities. That means people who are neurodivergent. That means people who are LGBTQIA plus, people of all different gender and sexual expressions, and also people who are not Jewish or who are not native to the Jewish tradition. And that, again, that's not a decision that was made in a vacuum. It was not a radical departure by Rabbi Jacobs, but I think that it was a firm affirmation of where the movement had been trending for a long time. When I was ordained in June of 2000, just 25 years ago this coming Monday, on Shavuot, that's nice. I attended my first CCAR convention in the Bay Area, in Northern California. And the big news from that convention in June of 2000 was a resolution by the Reform movement, by the CCAR, our rabbinic body, to part with the custom of turning prospective converts away 3 times before welcoming them. We've talked about that if you were with us for our classes on conversion this fall. The custom of shunning a convert, or not shunning, but turning away a convert, was intended to assess the candidate's sincerity. It's like, you sure you want to do this? We've been massacred. It's not an easy thing to be a Jew. You have to cut off your foreskin and stop eating delicious food. I mean, pork and shrimp. And then if they say, no, they come back 3 times. Okay, now we embrace you. The Reform movement officially, as a position, disavows that custom and says anyone who wants to be part of what we do ought to be embraced from day one. And that conversion, even though we do not evangelize, we do not missionize, anyone who is a possible or prospective candidate to be part of the Jewish people, either by just affiliation and association or marriage, even if they don't convert, but especially if they wish to or seem to be amenable to a conversation about conversion, should be approached about it. Like, we should actively encourage it in order to strengthen and grow our communities. So that's a beautiful place to end. And as you say, that's, I think, the dominant approach of Reform rabbis, Reform clergy. I include my clergy colleagues who are also fully authorized to conduct weddings and preside over all of the moments of Jewish family life and do so beautifully and attentively. I think all of us are committed to this idea that that's how we bring people closer to Sinai. So, Shabbat Shalom, Chag Shavuot Sameach. Tikkun Leil Shavuot, our service for welcoming Shavuot, takes place at 7:30 p.m. at Community Synagogue of Rai, where we're going to be doing more beer and whiskey tasting to celebrate the barley harvest and also doing some learning as well. So for those of you WRJ people who enjoyed getting a little toasted on Tuesday night at our end of year lecture, you can get even more of your fill with Rabbi Daniel Groper. I'll be there after our confirmation service, which you're also welcome to attend. A wonderful, if small but mighty class of 10th graders who will celebrate Shavuot by leading us in prayer 6 p.m. on Sunday. But before that, a beautiful Shabbat service tomorrow night. I hope to see many of you there, and I'll wish you Shabbat Shalom.
Kol hakavod, John.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Bye.
Yashua.